In the autumn of 1991, a sewer repair crew working beneath Canal Street in Lower Manhattan cut through a section of pipe casing and struck something that was not pipe. It was timber, blackened and swollen, with a century and a half of groundwater, laid in a crib pattern beneath the modern infrastructure. The city's utility maps showed nothing at that depth except the line they had come to fix. The crew called it in, photographed it, and closed the trench within the day, because Canal Street does not stay open for anyone, and the work order did not include an excavation. What they had found was a fragment of the old drainage works built in 1811 to carry off a pond that no longer exists, in a city that no longer remembers where its water used to go. Canal Street is not named for a canal that runs through the neighborhood. It is named for the canal that used to be the neighborhood, a stone and timber channel dug to drain a lake the Lenape had called Kalkhoek before the Dutch shortened it, and that the English later called the Collect. The pond is gone. The street that replaced its outflow still floods first in every storm, and every crew that opens the ground beneath it still finds the same wet, unstable fill, and occasionally, still, the timber. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Collect was, by every colonial account, the finest fresh water on the island. It sat where Foley Square and the Manhattan Detention Complex now stand, fed by underground springs deep enough that surveyors in the 1700s could not find its bottom with the rope they had. A Lenape village called Werpos stood on its northern bank for generations before the Dutch arrived, positioned exactly where a village belongs, on high ground above clean water, with a view of the approach from every direction. The Lenape were the people of this island. The Haudenosaunee, the confederacy of 6 nations that English colonists called the Iroquois, held their council fires to the north and west, across a territory that stretched from the Mohawk Valley to Lake Erie, bound together under what they call the Great Law of Peace. The 2 nations were neighbors, not strangers. Trade paths connected them, and Haudenosaunee runners and diplomats moved through Lenape territory on business that predated any European map. What passed between them about the ground itself, about the springs and the hollows and the places where water moved beneath the surface, was never written down by either side in a form that survived, because neither side kept its knowledge that way. It was carried, generation to generation, by people who did not expect anyone to need it recorded. The island's water did not stop at the Collect. A network of smaller streams and tidal creeks ran through what are now some of the densest blocks in the world, among them Minetta Brook, which once wound through the land that became Greenwich Village, and still, to this day, occasionally seeps into basements along its old course, regardless of how many layers of concrete have been poured on top of it. Building superintendents on Minetta Street have pumped water out of sub-basements for decades, and the reason is never a plumbing failure. It is the brook, doing what it has always done, indifferent to the fact that the city built over it more than 200 years ago. By 1811, the Collect had become a dumping ground for the tanneries and slaughterhouses that had grown up around it, and the city drained it, cutting a canal south to the Hudson to carry the water and the waste away together. The canal was covered over within a decade, and the street built above it took its name. The fill used to level the old pond bed was cheap and poorly compacted, and the neighborhood that rose on top of it, the 5 Points, spent the next 70 years sinking unevenly into ground that had never finished settling. Buildings leaned. Foundations cracked within a year of construction, and the engineers who tried to explain it kept arriving at the same answer, that you cannot build a stable city on the memory of a lake and expect the lake to stay forgotten. In 1865, a military engineer named Egbert Viele produced a document that has never gone out of use. His sanitary and topographical map of the city and island of New York recorded every stream, marsh, spring and pond that had existed on Manhattan before the grid was laid over it, reconstructed from old surveys, Dutch land records, and the visible low ground that still held water after every rain. Viele made the map to argue for a citywide drainage and sanitation system, and the city built one, but the map outlived its original purpose by more than a century. Structural engineers in New York still consult it today before certain foundation work, because a building set on filled marsh behaves differently than a building set on schist, and the difference has caused real damage more than once when it was ignored. The island Manhattan appears to be, solid from the Battery to inward, was never solid in the way the street grid pretends. It was hills, hollows, tidal creeks, and at least one hidden lake, graded flat and paved over inside a single lifetime. The Bedrock tells its own version of the same story. Manhattan schist sits close enough to the surface in Midtown and in Lower Manhattan to carry the weight of a skyscraper, which is why the tallest buildings on the island cluster in those two places and almost nowhere in between. Through much of Greenwich Village and Soho, the schist dips far deeper, buried under old streambed and glacial fill, and for most of the 20th century that stretch of the island stayed low, its buildings unable to reach the height the neighborhoods on either side of it achieved without driving foundations far past what was economical. The skyline of New York is, in a very literal sense, a map of what the rock underneath is doing, and the low gap in the middle of it marks where a buried valley still runs beneath the pavement. The people who did the physical work of setting Manhattan's foundations into that rock, generation after generation through the 20th century, were disproportionately Mohawk, one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee. The tradition began in 1886, when a bridge company contracted with the Kanawake Mohawk community near Montreal to help build a cantilever bridge across the St. Lawrence River, and the ironworkers who trained on that job discovered a talent and a comfort at height that the company had not expected and quickly came to depend on. Word passed through Kanawake and later through Akwesasne, another Mohawk community straddling the Canadian and American border, and within a generation, Mohawk ironworkers were traveling south for the boom in American skyscraper construction. They worked the Empire State Building, they worked the Chrysler Building, they worked the George Washington Bridge and both towers of the original World Trade Center, and after the 11th of September 2001, Mohawk ironworkers were among the crews who returned to that site to help clear it, a detail that circulated among ironworking families for years before it ever reached a wider audience, passed along at union halls and family dinners, long before any reporter thought to ask. Many of those workers settled with their families in Brooklyn, in a stretch of North Gowanus and Burham Hill that longtime residents still sometimes call Little Cornawga, close enough to the job sites to walk to work, and far enough from Manhattan rents to raise children on a steel worker's wage. The tradition became well known enough that the National Film Board of Canada eventually produced a documentary about it, following ironworkers from Kanawake as they traveled south for the New York jobs and returned home between contracts, a rhythm that repeated across 3 generations before commercial air travel made the commute even easier. The work these men did was not confined to the sky. Foundation work, caisson work, and the deep excavation required before a tower can rise all happen below street level first, in the same schist and glacial fill that the Viele map charted and the old collect pond once sat above. What they encountered down there, when the ground did not match the plans, when a shaft opened into a pocket of water nobody's survey accounted for, when timber or stonework older than any living memory turned up in a footing trench, is not the kind of thing that made it into engineering reports. It made it into the stories ironworking families told each other, the way any working trade passes down what the job actually involves once the official version has been filed and forgotten. Much of the paper record that might have connected Haudenosaunee history more formally to the land beneath New York does not exist anymore, not because anyone destroyed it deliberately, but because of a fire. On the 29th of March 1911, the New York State Capitol in Albany burned through the night, and the New York State Library housed inside it lost the majority of its manuscript collection, an archive that held one of the largest bodies of documentation on Haudenosaunee history and treaty relations in existence at the time, along with early survey records for large parts of the state. Librarians and firemen pulled what they could through the smoke, and what survived was often charred at the edges or soaked past legibility. The loss is still cited by historians working on Haudenosaunee source material today, because entire threads of documented history simply stop at that date, not from neglect, but from a single night nobody could have prevented. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. None of this means there is a mapped network of tunnels beneath New York that the Haudenosaunee alone understood, and modern engineers have simply failed to find. What it means is narrower and, in its way, more interesting. The island's original geography, its hidden springs, its buried lake, its uneven bedrock, was known to the people who lived here before it was paved, in the way a community knows the ground it depends on. Some of that knowledge crossed between nations through trade and diplomacy long before any surveyor arrived with instruments. A large share of the written record that might have preserved more of it burned in a single night in Albany. And when the city later needed people willing to descend into that same unstable, half-forgotten ground to set the foundations for its tallest buildings, it was, again and again, Mohawk ironworkers who did the work, carrying a relationship to height and depth that their own oral tradition had shaped over centuries, whether or not the city building on top of them ever thought to ask what they knew. The city's own deliberate tunnels tell a related story, even though nobody hid them. The old Croton Aqueduct, completed in 1842, carried fresh water more than 40 miles from the Croton River in Westchester into Manhattan through a masonry tunnel built mostly by hand, much of it buried far enough below the surface that New Yorkers walking above it for the next century had no reason to think about what ran beneath their feet. A large receiving reservoir once sat where the New York Public Library and Bryant Park now stand, its stone walls thick enough that sections were left standing and repurposed rather than fully demolished when the library was built above it. Stretches of the old aqueduct tunnel still exist today, some maintained, some simply abandoned in place because removing them was harder than leaving them where they were poured. New York has never been shy about building underground. It has been far less consistent about remembering what it built once the project that justified it was finished. Chinatown holds its own version of the pattern in Doyers Street, a short, sharply curved block that earned the name Bloody Angle in the early 20th century, when rival Tong associations fought for control of the neighborhood's gambling and opium trade. Basements along the street were connected by passages cut through shared foundation walls, allowing a man attacked at the bend in the street to disappear through a barber shop or a laundry and surface half a block away, long before police walking the same route above ground could follow. Some of those connecting passages were sealed over the following decades as buildings changed hands and basements were renovated for other uses, and no single map of the network was ever filed with the city because the people who built the passages had excellent reasons not to advertise them. A few blocks north, beneath City Hall, an ornate subway station built in 1904 still curves through the bedrock, tiled and vaulted in a style the rest of the system abandoned, once ridership made it clear the platform was too tight a curve for modern trains. The station closed in 1945 and has sat there since, intact, unused, passed by every downtown local train that loops through it without stopping, visible to anyone who stays on board past the last scheduled stop and knows to look out the window. Farther uptown, along the Hudson side of Riverside Park, a rail tunnel built in the early 20th century and largely abandoned by the 1980s became known informally as the Freedom Tunnel, after graffiti painted inside it by an artist who signed his work that way. For years before Amtrak resumed regular service through it, the tunnel sheltered a community of people who had built a settled, semi-permanent life in the dark beneath the park, where joggers and dog walkers passed directly overhead with no idea what was under them. A community documented in a widely seen film released around the turn of the millennium. Deep infrastructure in New York does not stay forgotten forever, and it rarely announces itself gently when it resurfaces. In 2007, a Con Edison steam pipe installed in the 1920s ruptured beneath Lexington Avenue near Grand Central, sending a geyser of scalding steam and pulverized debris more than 40 stories into the air during evening rush hour. A reminder that the pipes, vaults and tunnels, laid a century ago, are still down there, still under pressure, still doing their job until the day they suddenly do not. The utility crews of New York still hit the old world several times a year. Con Edison steam workers occasionally break into forgotten vaults dating to the 1880s that no current map lists. Subway maintenance teams working the older lines have found sealed side tunnels that lead nowhere the current system uses. Dead ends from construction plans abandoned before the 1920s. Foundation crews digging new towers in Lower Manhattan still occasionally hit groundwater in quantities the modern survey did not predict, in almost exactly the low ground Viele plotted a century and a half ago. In 2010, workers excavating for an underground security center at the rebuilt World Trade Center site uncovered the hull of a wooden ship roughly 32 feet long, buried in landfill dozens of feet below street level. Archaeologists later dated the timber to the 1740s and concluded the vessel had simply been used as fill when the shoreline was extended outward, sunk in place, and built over by people who had no reason to think anyone would come looking for it 270 years later. The dig crew had permits, deadlines, and a security center to finish. They stopped work long enough to document the hull, remove what could be safely lifted, and then continued the excavation on schedule because a functioning transit security center mattered more to the city in 2010 than a colonial shipwreck did, and the ground gave up its evidence on the city's timetable, not its own. Workers building the Second Avenue subway through the 2000s and 2010s made similar discoveries further uptown: old streetcar rails, forgotten building foundations, and construction debris from projects abandoned mid-century, all layered into the same unstable fill that has swallowed Manhattan's discarded infrastructure for 2 centuries without anyone keeping a single running account of what has gone into the ground and never come back out. No agency tracks these encounters as a single body of evidence, because each one is logged separately, by a separate department, as a routine complication in a routine job, and closed out within the week so the work can continue. The city has never commissioned a single survey that lays every one of these incidents over the old Lenape and Haudenosaunee geography at once, over the springs, the buried creek beds, the vanished pond, to see what pattern, if any, sits underneath modern New York. Werpos is gone. The collect is a parking structure and a courthouse now. The men who set Manhattan's foundations into its schist, block by block through the 20th century, are mostly gone too, though their children and grandchildren still work the trade, still travel down from Iroquois and Kanawake for the jobs, still gather in the same stretch of Brooklyn their grandparents settled, and still tell newer apprentices which sites have a reputation among the older hands for turning up something the plans did not mention. The ground itself has not changed nearly as much as the city built on top of it would like to believe. It still holds water where the old lake used to sit. It still resists a foundation in the middle of the island where the rock dips low. It still gives up timber and stonework it was never supposed to give up, on a Tuesday afternoon, to a crew that has a schedule to keep and no time to ask why it is there. No single office in New York is responsible for remembering all of this at once: the Lenape villages, the Haudenosaunee trade paths, the buried streams, the burned archive, the ironworkers who carried an old relationship with height and depth into a city that rarely asked where it came from. The knowledge exists in pieces, in a map from 1865, in a family's stories passed down in Kanawake, in a utility log filed and forgotten, in the ground itself, which has never once needed anyone's permission to remember what it is. The island remembers its own shape even when the street grid insists otherwise, and every so often, when someone opens the ground deep enough, it says so. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.